Hello and welcome. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Shree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest today is Todd S Purdum, longtime New York Times political and diplomatic correspondent. Our host, of course, is Sri Srinivasan. Todd is an author, journalist, and he has written for The Atlantic, Politco, Vanity Fair, and is a contributor to Airmail. We'll learn more about that during the show. Sri Srinivasan is the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors, a digital and virtual events consultancy. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer and guest host of Shree's Sunday New York Times Read Along. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Please like, please comment, please share, please retweet, tag your friends. Let them know we have a great show for you today. Without further ado, I'll bring on Sri Srinivasan. Hi, Sri. How are you doing?
Hello, good morning. How are you? Thank you, as always, Neil, for leading us on the read-along. We love doing this every single Sunday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We've been doing this for more than 5 years now. And look at this, Doug Levy's awake in California at 5:30 in the morning. Happy Sunday, glad to have this program. And he has been a guest on the show before. So hi, Doug, and welcome. And everyone else, tell us where you're watching from. Tell us how your Sunday is going. Tell us how your week has been. What a week for America and the world. And
in addition to Doug, our guest is also up early on the West Coast. So thank you both to Doug and Todd Purdum for joining us. We have a congratulations on 5 years. This is we're in the 6th year now of doing the read along, right?
Correct. The start of the 6th year, and that's Dr. Kapoor joining us from Long Island. Thank you for being here. Please tag and share with your friends right now. They can watch us live or later. Patricia is watching on LinkedIn. So we're on multiple platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Diane's watching from South Jersey, great friend of the show. We're always looking for guest ideas as we do this every single week. And Raghavan says, nice and good morning to you. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. And of course, we couldn't produce a show like this without a great team behind us. Sri and I are the ones on camera, but we have a full team behind us helping to make this a great experience. Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranauckas. Paula Kiger, in particular, is your host on Facebook. She produces the show from there, sharing links, engaging with the viewers, answering questions. Steve does the same on LinkedIn. Julia helps with analytics, and Carla is just incredible with her Rolodex, her years at the Times, and also other contacts. She's gotten some really great guests for us, so thank you, Carla, for everything that you do. This is what sets our show, I think, apart from a lot of others. Not only are we on several channels, but we have people helping and engaging with the audience on several channels, and that makes a big difference. So we have a few more people joining us. We have Anis Bashir from Kerala, India, truly an international show. And Dr. Kapoor is saying this is an amazing service we provide. This is something Shri started 6 years ago. I joined about 3 years ago. It's a great family, a great community that we've built up over time. Linda is joining us from Long Island. Our friend Stefan is joining us from Ramsey, New Jersey. We have Amy joining us from Connecticut. And she's glad that today's guest is Todd Purdum. And Cynthia Round, who is a mutual friend of ours, Shri. I didn't overlap with her, but we both worked at United Way at different times. And then you worked with her at the Met.
Amazing colleague from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and a great, wonderful friend. Thank you for being here, Cynthia.
Iceland.
Oh, nice.
I don't think we've had any guests from Iceland at least check in on the show today. Thank you very much. Any guesses on the pronunciation, Shri? Svavar?
I'm not
Alderson?
taking a chance, but Svavar sounds.
I took a guess, but thank you for joining us, sir. Appreciate it. And Dr. Sujata Chandrasekhar is joining us early on a Sunday morning. She and Dr. Marina Kurian host She's on Call, which starts at 11 a.m. just after our show. And they plan on having a great show as well. And Shri actually jumps in and produces that show. This
and
week,
they have
they're going to be focusing on...
Billy is joining
Go ahead, Shri.
this week. Yeah, she's a science reporter at the New York Times. Fantastic friend and a journalist who's been covering coronavirus and doing a great job with that. And Dr. Nina Shapiro is a pediatric ENT surgeon. So that'll be a great show at 11 a.m. Eastern on all the She's on Call channels. I'll also be resharing, so do catch that when you can at 11 a.m. Eastern, live or later.
Absolutely. And then we still have Ted Coltman joining from Washington, D.C., not far from where I am in Springfield, Virginia, and Pradnya Haldapur in Silver Spring, Maryland. So we have a little D.C., Maryland, Virginia action go, the DMV as folks call it, not the Department of Motor Vehicles, but D.C.,
That's a term,
Maryland,
by the
Virginia.
way, I had only heard first from Sonny Slaughter, one of our friends and former guests. Until then, I'd never heard DMV used that way.
Exactly. And Nikhil is joining us from Florida as well. Before we take a look at the paper, Shri, can you tell us a little bit about our sponsor, MuckRack?
But big thanks to our friends at MuckRack. This is a company that journalists know well because they provide verified profiles and portfolios for journalists as well as for PR people. So everyone should check that out at muckrack.com, and we'd love to have you be a sponsor of the show. You can email us. You can see our email address is right on screen, and ask us about sponsoring the show and connecting with this global community every Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. Many thanks to Greg Galland, Mike Schneider, and others at MuckRack.
That's great. So why don't we take a look at what's in the paper today, and then we'll bring on our guest, Todd Purdum. That's great. So we'll take a look at that.
There you go. Nice to see the print paper here. And Neil has laid this out beautifully. And we'll come back to the front section, but maybe we want to see what else is on. What's the lead story, Neil?
The lead story is actually a really incredible piece, and I read it online. There are little video snippets with it. Shouting, smashed glass, a lunge, then a gunshot. This is about the during the riot, the person who was shot trying to get in through a window, Ashley Babbitt, a Capitol police officer, feared for his life, feared for the safety of lawmakers. But the article breaks down exactly what happened with different camera angles. It's really it's frightening to read through and to watch the video. The display story is actually about the protest in Russia with Alexei Navalny being arrested after returning. He had been, if folks remember, he had been poisoned, was able to recover, and he's an opposition leader. He flew back and was promptly arrested. Other stories on the front page: the Muslims exult as Biden ends Trump ban. It's about a year. It was right after Trump took office in January that he instituted the Trump ban. Tried to several times. Virus ravages cramped homes in Los Angeles. Dense enclaves reflect surge's unequal toll. This is another interesting story. A House member, Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, was key to a plot in the Justice Department to replace Acting Attorney General Rosen with a Deputy Attorney General. Really interesting story there. And of course, a front page obit for the man who conducted 50,000 interviews over his career, Larry King. Incredible story there. Not on the front page, I think it was the day before, but Henry Aaron passed away as well. Student suicides push Las Vegas schools to open. So that's an interesting development in the pandemic. So that's mostly what's on the front page. What we have in the rest of the paper, Arts and Leisure, it's about Moulin Rouge, the musical. When the music suddenly stopped at Moulin Rouge, financial strain, heartbreak, and so much illness. The show's cast and crew look back on life after Broadway went dark. It was doing really well just before COVID-19 hit. The at-home section, which effectively replaced the travel section. It's an interesting graphic on the cover. We're putting on our thermals to eat soup outside. We're reaching out and making new friends even in isolation. We're getting a full body workout in just 7 minutes. And when we've done our stepping jacks, we'll weave our paper into a classic gag, the finger trap. This is one thing they've done with the home section. They've given instructions to create everything from origami to wrapping paper, to have fun with the actual paper, the newsprint. Sunday Review. Help people fast. Democrats can make government look good again. That's looking at what the Biden administration is trying to do in short order, everything from speeding up delivery of the vaccine to stimulus checks, addressing climate change, etc. The three stories they're teasing at the top, and I just want to draw attention to that. Nepalis plant their own flag and capture one of the last great prizes in mountaineering. It's on the top left. This article I'm definitely interested in reading later as a father of a girl. Do we keep girls' bodies secret to protect boys? And if so, protect boys from what? That should be an interesting read. And then the GPS system is essential but also vulnerable. We need a backup. That's the story on the top right. Sunday Business. It's your kids are seniors, Shri. My daughter is 7 years old, so this is aimed more for 8th graders, parents of 8th graders. Good grades can fetch money, a scholarship, and it's all about financial aid and making sure that kids understand how financial literacy to understand the process, what they'll be getting into. So that'll be interesting to take a look at. Sunday Styles. The uneven rollout of COVID-19 vaccines is likely to create a temporary social elite, with the idea that people who have the vaccine can travel, can go out to eat, etc. We'll see how that plays out over the next several months. The book review, the cover article is Separated at Birth, American Baby, a Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption, written by Lisa Belkin. And the magazine, again, more on COVID-19. This is the issue with people who are long haulers. What if you never get better? Even when the pandemic is over, some COVID-19 patients could be living with persistent symptoms for years. How can they be treated? And what's interesting is that they're teasing both the cover story, but also My Long COVID Nightmare by Laura Holson. That's what's teased on the cover here. So that's a tour of the paper this morning, Shri.
Thank you, Neil. Can't wait to read more of those stories and hear about them. And just now I'm excited that we can talk about a lot of these stories with our guest, Todd Purdum. And so with that, let's bring Todd on, and let's remind everyone to please tag your friends and share this so that they can watch live or later. We're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Our guest is Todd S Purdum, longtime New York Times political reporter, correspondent. He's also worked at The Atlantic, Politico, Vanity Fair, and Airmail. He started as a copy boy at the New York Times and rose to LA bureau chief, Washington correspondent, and more. And we're just delighted that he's with us at 8:45 Eastern, which is for him 5:45 Eastern, Pacific time. Thank you so much for being here, Todd.
It's my pleasure, Shri. Thanks for having me.
And first, we always ask, how are you and how's your family been handling the pandemic?
We're hanging in there. It's been a challenge for us. It has for everybody. Our college-age daughter is a junior at Barnard College in New York, and she came home very suddenly last spring and took the rest of the semester in her bedroom. Our son's an 11th grader here. He's been doing the same, and I must say being a remarkably good sport about it. Since August, our daughter's been back in New York, living off campus with roommates, being careful about COVID. She was home for Christmas, but she's hanging in there. And, here in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County in particular, there's been an awful COVID surge in the post-Thanksgiving period. So we're still at the moment under a lockdown order here, and we've been very careful. I go to the grocery store, and that's the extent of my adventures these days. I really don't go any farther afield. But we're all healthy and safe. We know some friends. We've lost some friends to COVID, sadly, but we're hanging in there. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. I see that's pitch black outside. So are you?
The dawn will come up like thunder while we're talking, I guess. So.
Are you a Sunday morning person typically, or is this unusual?
Well, 5:45 is a little unusual, but I am a Sunday morning person, and I must say, in the 15 years since I left the New York Times, the Sunday paper, which used to be a miracle, but an obligation and a kind of rebuke. I felt I had to read it. Now I want to read it, and I do read it very thoroughly, but it's not the same kind of heavy weight that it used to be when it would land on the doorstep, and I'd feel that, I really absolutely had to read my colleagues' work. I had to be prepared to talk about it with them. I had to be prepared to see them. And I just had to, it felt like homework. And now it feels like what it always has been, which is a pleasure. But yes, we have a Sunday morning ritual with the papers and the dog and, kind of quiet time. And it's a nice moment to have for yourself.
Yeah, I can understand that. One of our viewers is just getting ready to walk her dogs in the cold, and she just mentioned that. So slightly different, of course, out in California. I was reading this morning that in some poor neighborhoods in LA, the coronavirus is 100 times higher rate than in places like Bel Air. What do you account for how California has handled this entire crisis? As we know, Northern California was among the first in America to lock down and all of that. They seem to be doing the right things, but how have we ended up here? Just as a country, of course, we're at 4,000 deaths when we were complaining about 1,000 deaths a day. We've had several days in a row of 4,000 deaths a day. So the whole country has done badly, but what is it about California that we're in this situation, LA in particular?
Well, Sri, that's a real mystery and something that people are still struggling to understand. As you might have seen the other day, there's research at Cedars-Sinai and elsewhere that there might have been a special variant, a more contagious variant like the one that was found in Britain and South Africa and so on, that's native to California. And that might have helped explain some of the post-autumn spread here. But you pointed out another reality. And yes, California, Northern California, here in Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, Governor Newsom statewide, California was sort of leading the nation in its effective response to holding the virus at bay. But one of the issues in Los Angeles that is not widely understood by the public, I think, is there are parts of Los Angeles that are very dense indeed, and multi-generational households where people are crammed into small houses, small apartments. We think of LA as sprawling, and it is, and we don't think of it as dense in the way you think of, say, Manhattan or New York City, but it is in its own way, even despite its sprawl. I mean, Los Angeles County is something like 3/5 the size of Connecticut in area, but there are pockets of incredible dense residential living where one generation, and this is also people who often are essential workers or food service workers or people who work in congregate settings like nursing homes, care facilities, hospitals. They don't have the choice of going to work. They can't work on Zoom. They have to go out in the world. And then the fact that they're all living on top of each other is a factor in the spread.
Yeah, so sad to hear that. You, of course, know LA so well because you were LA bureau chief for the New York Times. Talk about that, the role that California plays in kind of the New York Times and its talking about the world. Now there's, of course, a California newsletter and all of that the Times does. But when you were there, how did the New York Times treat California and, being aware, of course, about the East Coast bias and all of that?
Yes, well, when I was here 20 plus years ago, it was probably the best job I've ever had in my life, being the Los Angeles bureau chief of the New York Times, because it was like being a foreign correspondent. And even then, because of the national edition and the nascent web, the Times had a national and global audience. But there was a way in which, if you were the representative of the New York Times in Los Angeles, you had license to write about Southern California as if it were a foreign country, in a sense. And you could explain the byways and folkways, and ideally avoiding the cliches, and particularly avoiding the East Coast tendency to sneer at Southern California. But one of the realities then as now is that in particular fields in Los Angeles, certainly the entertainment business, there are a lot of transplanted New Yorkers who live in Los Angeles whose mothers and fathers read the New York Times. And they were very happy and eager to have their exploits detailed in the paper, because it would be read by the home folks back in the Big Apple. And that was something that worked very much in the favor of the Los Angeles Bureau of the New York Times. It was also just a license to roam widely around the Southwest. My territory included Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii. You could go to Hawaii for 1 week of what turned out to be very hard work and probably produce 5 page-one stories, because people didn't visit from the mainland very often, and there were all sorts of interesting things going on. So I count myself, I grew up in the Midwest, I went to school and worked in the East, and living in California on these 2 different tours has been a very important part of my life.
Thank you. Tell us about starting at the New York Times as a copy boy. How did that come to be? And maybe a little bit more about where you grew up and all of that.
I grew up in a small town in Illinois called Macomb, about 250 miles southwest of Chicago and 150 miles northeast of St. Louis. I went to college at Princeton in New Jersey, and in my senior year, I was the campus correspondent or stringer for the New York Times. So I began working for the New York Times when I was about 21 years old. After graduation, it was the summer of 1982 and the Reagan era recession. Jobs were hard to find. Newspaper jobs were particularly hard to find, and I wrote, I think, something like 135 application letters to papers around the country, and was almost universally told, get 3 to 5 years experience at a paper and apply again. So I kept wondering how I could get the 3 to 5 years experience if no one would hire me. Anyway, I had contacts at the Times from having been the stringer, and I applied for a copy boy's job and was hired in the fall of 1982. And I went to work on the night shift, 4 to 11:30 or 5 to 1 in the morning, very occasionally 7:15 to 2:45, the close of the paper in the middle of the night. And my jobs included, carrying around bits of wire service copy, going to the morgue or newspaper library and bringing back archival clippings for editors to consult, and fetching coffee and theater tickets and running errands around Manhattan for the senior editors of the paper. It was a real education and something that gave me really a tour d'horizon of the whole operations of the newsroom and of the printing and technical production aspects of the paper as well, from the basement to the executive suite.
And of course, the reason you had a morgue and you had to go collect all of that was because we didn't have the internet. You didn't even have Nexus to do what later you were able to do later in your career. What are some of the things you learned as a copy boy about work and about the Times that helped you survive and thrive at the paper, and that you were able to then transfer or pass on to younger folks who came behind you?
Well, I guess in terms of survival, I learned to, I don't mean this to sound as pessimistic as it may sound, but I learned to expect the worst. I mean, all sorts of crazy things could happen. The Times, by the time it was published in an offset process, and the newsroom was electronic, so the paper was edited electronically, but many editors were still used to the ink on paper world in which they got printed pieces of wire service copy. So one of the copy boy's assignments was to carry those little pieces of paper around to the various news desks, and then the arrival of that slip of paper would tell the relevant editor to call up the story from the AP or from the Times itself on his or her computer and do the editing work there. So it was a kind of hybrid. There was still one foot very much in the past, one foot coming into the digital future. As I got there, there was an electronic retrieval system for past stories, crude by today's standards. but most editors still wanted to get the paper clips, which were one of the glories of the paper was its incredibly well organized photo and clipping morgue, which stored, you know, decades and decades of past stories from the Times, and was indexed in a very complicated cross-referenced way that allowed people to look up material by the byline of the reporter, by the subject matter, and so forth. And so that was an education as well.
Thank you. Here are some of the questions and comments coming. Patricia says, does Todd prefer the paper over digital subscription?
I have a paper subscription. I read the paper digitally. I continue to be surprised often when I get the paper in the morning that I've seen so much of the content already digitally. I'm like, didn't I read this already? Where did I read this? But for me, nothing quite compares with I'm an avid reader of the digital version of the paper, and I particularly admire some of the creative, incredibly innovative and elegant things the paper can do that way. Sri pointed out the story about the Capitol riot and the blow-by-blow video account of the killing of the protester. But I still like the serendipity of sort of strolling through the paper, finding unexpected little stories tucked away. I find that, you know, reading the paper digitally is like shopping digitally. If you know what you want and you know where to go look, and you look at the political coverage or you look at the international coverage, it's fine. If you just want to have the immersive experience of walking through the aisles of a bookstore, there's nothing like holding the paper in your hands. But I realize I'm among the last generation of people for whom that will be an important or normative experience.
As you saw Neil lay out the paper there and all these different sections, when you left in 2005, 2006, how did you expect the paper to be, you know, a decade or so after? Are you surprised to see it still having all these sections and still being what it is today in the print form?
No, I'm not really, because the history of the modern paper from certainly the 1970s on, when it faced many challenges and adapted by creating these specialized sections that we still have on the weekdays, Science Times, Living, Home, and so forth. I guess we don't have the home section on Thursdays anymore the way we used to, but you know, the pandemic is a perfect example how the travel section suddenly pivoted and became the at-home section, or these special photo essays or narratives, special sections, or the for children only section. The story of the Times in the past 50 years has been one of perpetual innovation, and there are still things I think that only print can do. I mean, obviously, if you're going to provide the readers with a piece of newsprint that can turn into wrapping paper or a finger trap, that's not something that you can, at least now yet, do digitally. I used to joke that, you know, people wouldn't take the digital paper certain places you can imagine where they might take the paper, but now I think with Androids and iPhones and so on, tablets, people do take the digital paper with them wherever they may be, and certainly there's connectivity in the wider world, or, you know, sidewalk cafes, or walking along the street in ways that a very short time ago we couldn't have begun to imagine.
When I was teaching digital journalism early at Columbia Journalism School, one of the things we would say is that the paper would have to be something you could take, or a tablet would be something that it would take to multiple things that start with the letter B: the boardroom, the beach, the bus, the bathroom. And that's sort of what you're indicating, that now the paper is everywhere.
You can take them to all those places. And I was reminded the other day that 20 odd years ago, when I first was arriving in Los Angeles, the University of Southern California's Annenberg School asked me to be on a panel with Mike Kinsley, the founding editor of Slate, which was then a new digital journalism experiment, and Matt Drudge, who was just then becoming Matt Drudge, and me on the topic, is internet journalism journalism? I think we know the answer to that now in a resounding way.
Yeah. Speaking of Matt Drudge, I think he played a role in this particular election cycle. You know, the way that in the old days, they said that when the Johnson administration lost Walter Cronkite, they lost, they lost America. In a way, you saw that Drudge turned against Trump after supporting him in 2016. In the 2020 cycle, about halfway through the election cycle, he really turned against Trump, and that affected at least some portion of the internet. Certainly not all of America. I thought we could just take a look at the front page of the New York Times and have you just reflect on these stories and what you think of them and how they're laid out and how these are covered, and also the difference between today and as you grew up at the time. So do you want to just walk us through a couple of these stories?
Well, sure. I mean, the first most immediate difference is color. There was no color photography when I arrived at the paper, and its introduction was a dramatic and in some ways somewhat controversial thing. At that time, color reproduction in newsprint was difficult to achieve with high quality. I think there was a lot of concern that the New York Times wanted to have very high quality color photos if it was going to run them. At the time, USA Today had a kind of day-glow, design look, and there was a great deal of emphasis on the Times not looking like that and not having blurred overprinting in the color photography. The sheer size of this front page photograph is in some ways a legacy of the brief tenure of Howell Raines, who was executive editor from 2001 to 2003. And he was a student of photography, a lover of photography, and he was the person who, really pioneered the use of photographs of this size. By the time I got to the paper, the format of columns was already 6 columns. It had been for years and years skinnier, narrower 8-column format. During my tenure there, Max Frankel was the executive editor, and as he got a little bit older, he realized his eyesight was getting a little bit worse. So the font size of the body type was very subtly increased just by a tiny bit, and the leading, the space between each line, was increased to make for easier reading. So the Times is visually easier to read, easier to look at, more visually striking now than it was 40 years ago. No doubt about that.
Yeah, we have a nice comment here from Wayne Camadoy, who is designer at the paper. Said the serendipity of the paper is underrated. Glad Todd is still a print subscriber for this reason.
And the other thing that doesn't happen anymore, in the days of hot lead, and then even afterwards in the early days of offset, when layout was a sort of a crude science, and it was much more like your high school newspaper was than you would think a big world-class newspaper, there was not pagination. That is, you couldn't design and lay out an entire page on a computer. You'd have to print out on photo paper each story in columnar form. It would have to be cut and laid into the paper by printers with an X-Acto knife and hot wax and so on. And the result was, no matter how carefully you tried to measure the stories, no matter how carefully you tried to plan the length, there would still be little short gaps in the paper where they would routinely run tiny little stories, one paragraph. And the headline shorthand for these were K-heads, which is the smallest little story you could have. And the stereotypical but true story was often, a bus plunging off a cliff in some distant place in the world. These little fillers don't exist anymore, really. The paper doesn't need them because they can plan in advance just how much space. It was much more like a magazine design, really.
And here now you see also the mix of stories here. What do you think of these? And of course, here's a story about LA.
Yeah, about the density we talked about, right? Really effectively, how the multi-generation households and so on. Yes, and then of course the Times broke with on Friday evening with Katie Benner's excellent reporting, and I see now it seems to be joined with Katie Edmondson as well. This incredible story about how President Trump reached down into the ranks of the Justice Department and tried to conspire with the acting head of the Civil Division to make mischief by sending a threatening letter to officials in Georgia saying the Justice Department wanted to investigate the election results there. And only the threatened resignation of the acting attorney general and a raft of senior officials stopped the president from doing that. I guess he was reluctant to look like Richard Nixon in the Saturday Night Massacre, but that's a classic example of of a New York Times story that is, dominated the entire cable news infrastructure, and it's a big time scoop.
Here's a story from also your area. You were the LA bureau chief, but as you said, you covered other parts of the West Coast. And here's a story about Vegas and this unusual story: student suicides pushed Las Vegas schools to open.
No, I mean, one of the here in Los Angeles, the schools have been basically closed universally since March, and there's every sign they're going to continue to be closed for quite a bit of time to come. The public schools, and it's a real problem because there's food insecurity among the school-age population here. Sometimes the only meals those kids get are the breakfast and lunches that are provided at school. Younger children in particular have demonstrated difficulty with digital learning. There often aren't adequate internet connections or safe and quiet spaces in their homes for them to learn. So as hard as it is for a college or high school student to take classes virtually, I think it must just be brutally difficult for younger children.
I agree. And then here's a classic LA legend, Larry King passing. Thoughts on his passing or Henry Aaron's passing?
Well, of course, Henry Aaron was a hero not only of baseball but of civil rights more broadly, and of public life in America, and one of those people who come along only very rarely. Larry King was quite a character, a remarkable guy. I got to know him a little bit. I was on his show once or twice in my career. My wife and I happened, through happenstance of acquaintance with mutual friends, to be invited to his 67th birthday party, or possibly 66th birthday party 20 years ago in Beverly Hills. And it was a fascinating affair with some of his friends and old time Hollywood types like Milton Berle and Don Rickles. And Don Rickles, the famous insult comic, toasted Larry King's birthday by saying that, Larry, you have the face of a Buick, a Jew Buick, Larry. And it was a very wonderful, kind of only in LA sort of evening. But Larry was famous for staying friends with his gang of guys that he'd known since his youth. He'd go to breakfast until very recently, I think, every morning at Nate and Al's Delicatessen in Beverly Hills, have the same routine. When he had his show here, it was usually based in the CNN building in Hollywood. And really, the world went through his doorstep. Seeing the clips on CNN last night and early this morning, it was really a reminder of just how large he loomed in his heyday.
I remember seeing and being reminded after watching the TV clips yesterday that he had at one point, Ross Perot, first he announced his run that had such a big implication on the election that year on his show. And then he had a debate, Al Gore versus Ross Perot about NAFTA. And then he also had Arafat, Rabin, and the King of Jordan all on the same show. So he had obviously a lot of entertainers and people like that, but he also mixed it up with serious topics. I guess because you became the LA bureau chief in '97, you missed the bulk of the O.J. Simpson era stuff. But
yes, I did. I missed even the civil trial. I missed the criminal trial and I missed the civil trial. But I did have a remarkable experience, which was when O.J.'s former house was up for sale. Fred Sands, the leading kind of realtor to the stars in Los Angeles, gave me a tour of O.J.'s house, and I saw the air conditioner outside Cato Kalin's guest house where went bump in the night, and the tennis court and all of this. And of course, the house was subsequently razed after it was sold and torn down. Carly Simon and James Taylor had once lived in the same house. So I only got the exhaust fumes of OJ, you might say, but it was still it was fresh enough in people's minds that it was a dominant phenom when I arrived in Los Angeles.
I was a amateur consumer of a lot of OJ news, but I did not know that Brentwood House belonged to Carly Simon and James Taylor. So you can always learn more OJ trivia, it turns out.
There was a little sign on the tennis court that had a strange overtone in the wake of the murders that said it was a reproduction of a British pub sign. It was in that sort of style of a carved wood sign. And it said, mixed doubles are limited to 10 minutes knocking up time on center court. And I think it had to do with tennis warm-ups, but it had a different ring in the aftermath of that tragedy, certainly.
Sure. Amy says, we'd like to hear Todd's view of what these paired passings say about culture regarding celebrity.
Well, I wonder, I mean, Neil pointed out that Hank Aaron's obituary did not run on the front page, whereas Larry's did. Is that what the question is about, or is it just like...
Or just about how we consider celebrity? I did not see the front page of the paper yesterday. Do we know that it didn't run yesterday on the front page, on the Saturday version? Maybe unless he died too late or something. I would think Hank Aaron would get a front page obit.
Did it, Neil? I don't know. I thought I heard you say that earlier.
I think he just meant today it wasn't on the front page.
Oh, today. Sorry. No, sorry. Yes, I think it did run. I mean, I feel pretty sure it had to have run. I'm sure it did. In fact, it was multiple coverage. Well, you know, going back to the days of H.L. Mencken, America is not unique, but it's somewhat singular in its obsession on celebrities. And, you know, the front pages give equal treatment to the president and the Larry King and the baseball players and of the world. So, but of course, you know, Henry Aaron was much more than just a celebrity. He was really a pioneer of civil rights, and he was part of the second generation that, you know, Jackie Robinson had paved the way, but Henry Aaron then walked through the door in the full flower of his career. So I think, you know, it's natural to a celebrity death that I was definitely surprised at the kind of resonance it seemed to have was Alex Trebek of Jeopardy. I wasn't prepared for what a cultural icon he had become, because of course I'm old enough that I remember the original host of Jeopardy, Art Fleming. And he didn't loom anywhere near as large in the culture, didn't have anything like Alex Trebek's long run. But I was slightly taken aback by that. And then there was actually some commentary in the Times alumni Facebook group about the play of his obituary and about the way that it seemed to have touched people. And it had to do with a kind of, I think, decency and, you know, what's the word? Maybe a substantive appreciation for knowledge and facts that maybe loomed as more precious in the world we're living in now than you might have thought it would have.
Wayne weighs in to say Hank Aaron was on A1, and that would have been on Saturday that he was on
yes,
A1.
Yes. Sorry, that's all.
Patricia says, "Oh, thanks for sharing tender memories." And one thing I want to encourage everyone: you're watching a conversation with Todd Purdum, former diplomatic and political correspondent at the New York Times, former LA bureau chief at the New York Times, writer for Vanity Fair, at Politco, and host of other places. And we'll hear more about some of his work. But I want to say that people are tagging their friends, like Pradnya is tagging her friends on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook, and then they can watch this live or later. And I do want to check with Todd, you are not on social media. How did you reach that decision to not be there?
It's like the Wizard of Oz. I can't come back. I don't know how it works. I have one toe in Facebook, largely to read some groups that are affinity groups like New York Times alumni. I just never was tempted by Twitter. I admire its reach. I know I have many journalist friends who do it. It's probably not in my self-interest not to be on social media, because it's become clear to me what a useful reporting tool it can be in terms of finding people who are experiencing, particularly in a phenomenon like the pandemic. You can find people who are coping in their daily lives with the results of something like COVID-19. I just felt that I guess I have few enough unexpressed thoughts as it is, and the notion that I might be tempted to express more than I should on a platform like Twitter seemed to me a risk worth avoiding. But I realized I'm not. I realize I'm an outlier, and I realize I'm probably missing a lot by not being able to at least be part of it when I want to be part of it. And maybe it's never too late to learn a new trick or two.
Here's a pointer from Wayne to a Twitter post from Ben Hoffman at the NY Times. I couldn't be more proud of the coverage of Hank Aaron's death. He was a titan, and it was all hands on deck with contributions from all these journalists, and a wonderful obituary by Richard Goldstein. And again, you can tell us about the fact that places like the Times prepare obits in advance. Did you get to do many of those, and have any run after you left the Times where the obit was then updated and then published?
I did have the chance to do it, and I enjoyed it very much. One or two that I wrote, the client has since died, but the obituary had been redone in the meantime because events had changed the interpretation of that person's life or the necessity for having updates. I think I have at least one important one still on file that I expect will run someday. I hope not too soon. I can't say who it is, but it's a person I admire very much and certainly hope he'll be with us for many more years. But yes, I did. And it's one of the glories of the Times, the advance obituaries. And there are, enormous numbers of people who are there safely waiting to be memorialized appropriately. And I did my share of them, and it was really always a pleasure to do.
The one that you're proud of writing, did you get to interview the person and talk to them?
It was a person who, when I wrote it, was ill and in the hospital, but it was a person I'd known very well, so I'd interviewed him before. I didn't interview him for the obituary, but I knew him very well, so I could bring that to bear.
Hopefully it won't run for a long time, as you said.
Hopefully it won't for a long time.
Kevin McKenna, Deputy Business Editor at the Times. Howdy, Todd. Miss your New York Times byline, and working together as always. You have a great eye for detail.
Well, that's very nice of Kevin to say. I think I owe Kevin something very important, which is really, in a sense, my marriage, because
wow.
He was the first person to flag to me a comment made by my now wife, Dee Dee Myers, who had left her job as the White House press secretary, and she was being interviewed someplace, and there was a story about it in the New York Observer, and she was asked to talk about reporters, and she said that if I recall correctly, Maureen Dowd was brilliantly talented, but her column was sometimes snotty, and she listed me for something Maureen, who's a good friend, kidded her about, or not so kidded her about for a long time. But she described me as I think something like a good reporter who's also very fair. And I barely knew her then, but Kevin flagged this to me, and I think he clipped the thing and put it in the in-house mail envelope in the ancient days of pre-email to show it to me. And I thought, gee, that's a nice thing for her to say. And it was definitely something that in future interactions made me think that maybe she thought well enough of me to return my phone calls. So anyway, it's something I've always remembered and been grateful for.
Wow, what a story that is, and a great icebreaker. I'm sure it was down the road to do that with TD. That's great. And Kevin's a wonderful friend who is very kind to young journalists, as he was to me when we met. I'm always grateful for him watching our show, and is a former guest as well. Mel McRae says, "What do you think about the Times trying to make up for not writing obits about Black people?" We know Mel from Columbia Journalism School, and Todd is a former colleague of the Princeton Alumni Weekly Advisory Board, and he's referring to the overlooked efforts of the New York Times. We had Amy Padnani, who launched Overlooked as a guest on this show a few weeks ago, couple of months ago, and so your question is about that series.
Well, I think it's a fascinating and very laudable effort, and of course, it's the overlooked obituary feature is not just African Americans, but particularly a lot of women. It kind of grew up, I think, in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, and it's a welcome. Well, it's been astounding, frankly, to see some of the people who weren't properly sent off in the New York Times at the time of their deaths. And I think it's been, one of the great, Ida B. Wells being a leading example, but it's been a wonderful resource, and it's frankly reflected one of the great traditions of the Times, which is being a kind of a living history textbook every day. And the notion that these lives are being appropriately celebrated, appropriately noted, is, I think, something really, really valuable to have.
That's great. Thank you.
Hi, Mel. Nice to see your voice in the chat.
But just surprised that Diane Arbus didn't get a obit in the Times. And Roberta says, great question, Melvin. And she's also saying hi to to Kevin McKenna. Jay says that I heard that after JFK died, the Times started pre-writing obits. Is that correct from your knowledge?
I think it might have predated that, but one of the crisis obituaries that I know was written live. And the first man who began really, pardon me, pre-writing obits in a large way was a Times reporter named Alden Whitman. And I believe that when T.S. Eliot, the great poet, died, Alden had to write his massive obituary on deadline and I think shortly after had a heart attack. So there definitely was a realization that you couldn't properly sum up these remarkable lives usually on deadline, or that if you did so, you risked, missing something. I remember when I was still at the Times in the Washington Bureau in the early 2000s, I wound up having to write live on deadline obituaries for both Walt and Eugene Rostow, the JFK, LBJ era foreign policy intellectuals. And it was a daunting challenge. They both led really interesting, complicated lives. They both were in the center of Vietnam policy in the 60s. And only the very diligent, thorough paper clipping morgue in the Washington Bureau allowed me to do it on deadline. But it would have been much better to have some time to think about it.
Thank you. Patricia asks, who is Todd's most memorable mentor?
Well, that's a complicated question, I suppose. I have many. The person I think I have most to thank for my career at the Times is probably Anna Quinlan, the great columnist and novelist now, who, when I was a youngster at the paper, did a tour as the deputy metropolitan editor, and she was in charge of the Metro desk in the summer of 1984 when I had a tryout as a reporter. And she supported me and mentored me, and she, every time I thank her for this, she disclaims any particular responsibility. Another very important mentor of mine at the paper was Al Siegel, who was the longtime assistant managing editor in charge of the news desk, in charge of the style. He ultimately became the first standards editor of the paper in the wake of the Jason Blair scandal. And I was his clerk, news assistant, for a couple of years, or 18 months, something like that. And I learned a great deal from him about the standards and integrity and the folklore and byways of the paper. And he was, a model of excellence in journalism that I think people at the Times, still point to all the time. I was supported throughout my career by wonderful editors and mentors, from, Dean Baquet, the current editor, to Joe Leleveld and Max Frankel and Bill Keller, and even Howell Raines, who had supported my work. So I really I have a great deal of gratitude to the paper, and I always will. I mean, it taught me everything I know about journalism, and I've been trying to be worthy of it ever since.
Pradnya says Dee Dee Myers is amazing. So for people who missed why she's saying that, if they just joined, you'll have to give us a little background.
Well, Dee Dee, who just walked down the stairway a moment ago, it's rather early here. I hope I didn't wake her up. She grew up she was a Navy daughter and grew up all over the country, Florida, Southern California. But when her father got out of the Navy in the late 1960s, she grew up in northern LA County, Southern California. She got her start here in politics working for Mayor Tom Bradley, among other people. As a young woman, she worked for various Democratic politicians, Walter Mondale, Mike Dukakis, on their California presidential campaigns. She worked for Dianne Feinstein's unsuccessful campaign for governor of California in 1990. And in the fall of 1991, a longtime friend introduced her to the governor of Arkansas, a man named Bill Clinton. And all her friends said, "Oh, that'll be wonderful. You should go work for him. It'll be another losing Democratic campaign, but you'll get great experience." And of course, we know the rest is history. Bill Clinton wound up winning the presidency. Dee Dee went with him, was his first White House press secretary, the first woman, the second youngest person ever to hold the job. And she's gone on to a wonderful career since as a co-host of Equal Time on CNBC television, as a contributor to Vanity Fair. And she is now the director of Governor Newsom's Office of Business and Economic Development for the state of California. She's basically California's official ambassador to the capitalist world, helping navigate the shoals of this pandemic and its terrible effects on California's economy. And we moved back to California 6 years ago because she became the director of communications at the head of communications, Warner Brothers Studios, a job that she held until last spring when she left to resume her life in public affairs. So we've been married. We'll be married 24 years in May, and I'm incredibly lucky every day of my life because of that.
Well, please say hello and greetings from us, and we hope we didn't disturb her so early in the morning. Rick Burke, who is a former colleague of yours and a former guest on this show as the editor of Stat News, says Todd has the singular ability to capture the mood of the nation in cue heads at big moments like the space shuttle disaster. What is your secret of doing them so fast and memorably? And please tell us what a cue head is.
Well, cue head, thank you, Rick. Hello, good to see you. I owe you an email. A cue head is, the designation refers to the style of headline, which is called a cue head. It's an italic headline. It used to be I should know the typeface. I guess it might have been Bookman italic typeface. It's a news analysis. It's a story that attempts to put some perspective on the events of the day. One colleague described the goal of a cue head as related to the news story of being a sort of yes, but. In other words, here's the story, but here's more about how it happened, what it means. I would say the reason for my ability to do them quickly is plain and simple fear. When the deadline is looming and you have to fill the space, adrenaline kicks in, and you just kind of go on autopilot. And the dangers with cue heads, of course, is they amount to a form of instant analysis, and as we know, instant analysis often proves to be wrong. So the best you can hope for is if you're wrong, that you're wrong for the right reasons when you wrote it. If you're right, you're lucky, and the idea is to bring in a little bit of history, perspective, past experience. The Times used to have a sort of informal but pretty serious, not ban, but strong predisposition against ever using the word unprecedented, on the theory that everything that happens is a little bit like something that's already happened before. And except for the internet or Donald Trump, I think that might be true. But I would say that, when we come to the presidency of Donald Trump or the advent of the internet, unprecedented doesn't seem an overstatement. But anyway, so the idea is to hearken to the past to explain the present. That's the goal of a cue head.
Thank you. And we're looking at your piece that you wrote when the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. And this is the opening line: to sleeping Texans who heard the boom, boom, it was the sound of the sky falling. To the clinical voice controller at NASA's Mission Control, it was a contingency. To Americans already grappling with a confluence of threatening events, the instinctive reaction was, what next? And I forgot that this was 17 years ago. 17 years to the week that the two shuttle disasters had happened.
Yes, and of course, the Times was in the forefront of the coverage of the Challenger disaster. It won a Pulitzer Prize from my old friend David Sanger and others, who really were the first to break the cause of that disaster, which was the cold, frozen, shrunken O-rings that insulated the fuel in the rockets. And that happened. This disaster that I wrote about happened on a Saturday morning. We had a young daughter at the time. Our son, I don't believe, had yet been born. No, he hadn't been. And I remember being awakened or summoned at home in Northwest Washington, running to the office. And I do think that I wrote that whole piece from a standing start in under 40 minutes because the Sunday deadline of the paper was looming really brutally. And that was definitely one of those things that probably involves a lot of coffee and, as I said, fear.
We were paying attention to it a little bit because, as you know, Kalpana Chawla was on the plane, was on the shuttle, born in India, an astronaut who made India very proud. And my father had actually, when he was deputy ambassador to Washington for India, had actually been to the launch. Not this was her second time on the shuttle, but on the first time they had he was substituting for the ambassador, and so as a deputy ambassador, he went to Cape Canaveral for that launch of the previous shuttle, not of this one in which she died. But overall, such a big tragedy. And when you go to Jackson Heights today, you see Kalpana Chawla Way in that Indian neighborhood in Jackson Heights. They have that there.
Well, in downtown LA, they have a tribute to Ellison Onizuka, who was the Japanese-American astronaut on the Challenger, and same kind of thing, a very proud member of that community here.
Rick says, I remember that Saturday AM as you broke that story and you had to cover it. So he's talking about that. And I'm just looking more, lots of comments. Deborah's watching from Fort Lauderdale. And then here, Laura Silverman is adding to Dee Dee's resume, something that you overlooked, she says.
That's a very fair point. And in fact, I can't say that I'm responsible for that role, but it occurred when we moved to Los Angeles for my job at the New York Times, and Dee Dee was a very supportive spouse. We were newly married, and she left Washington and the certainty of a television job to come here, and she wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen for her in her career next. And one of the things that happened was that she got a call from Aaron Sorkin, who said he'd written this pilot about the life of a White House. And she was really skeptical. She thought, will this get any traction? But she became a founding consultant on the show, and she had a wonderful experience in the writer's room at Warner Brothers, working with Aaron, Pat Caddell, the late Pat Caddell, Lawrence O'Donnell, and others on the show. And in fact, the press secretary, C.J. Craig, is I think universally acknowledged to have been inspired by Dee Dee.
And Pradnya says she's posted this on the West Wing Weekly group on Facebook, where Dee Dee has a major fan base. So,
well, I'll have to check that out. That's another good reason to be on social media.
There you go. Ron Thomas, who's a former guest and dear friend of the show, is watching from Dubai. Have you been to Dubai?
I have not been to Dubai. I've only been to Saudi Arabia. Dee Dee has been to Dubai because Warner Brothers has a theme park in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, and she's been to that part of the world, but I have not.
Okay, we have about half an hour left with you. Here's a fellow former New Yorker, Terry Ann Thompson, who was a colleague of mine in Columbia Journalism School, is now in Las Vegas, and it's 6:30 in the morning. She says, tuning in late. Thank you for being here, Terry. And tell us about Las Vegas. You've, I'm sure, had many opportunities to cover it. The changes over time. We, of course, saw a front page story about Vegas in today's paper.
Yes, I mean, one of the things about when I was here the last time, 20 plus years ago, Las Vegas was in the middle of trying to make itself more family friendly and present itself as a destination, not just for adults and gamblers, but so it had all these other experiential things, including, you know, the dolphins and the tigers and all of that kind of stuff. That largely seemed to have reached its natural limit. And I think Las Vegas has now returned and doubled down on the notion of itself as a fundamentally adult playground. But for me, one memorable visit to Las Vegas was there were a pair of brothers who, this was before the Capitol Hill and New York anthrax attacks post September 11th, but there were a pair of brothers who were experimenting with anthrax, and I forget exactly what their motivation was. They weren't terrorists, they were just kind of amateur scientists, as I remember, but there was a big scare in Las Vegas that these people were plotting some kind of a terrorist activity. So I went on a very short notice to Las Vegas to cover this, and it was, and I assume it probably must still be, rather a challenge to be in Las Vegas on business that isn't gambling or entertainment. So I stayed at the MGM Grand Hotel, and as I recall, my room rate was something like $89 a night. In those days, you know, there were very good bargains even for luxury hotels. But when I checked out after 2 or 3 days, my bill was $2,000, and it turns out that the fax bill in those pre-internet or early internet days was like $1,500, because every time you had to go to the business center they punished you. They didn't want you to go to the business center. They wanted you to go to the blackjack table. So they charged you something like, $15 a page to get a fax. And I was absolutely astounded to see that I'd run up this big bill, basically for business communication.
How did your editor take that signing off?
They accepted it. They believed it. I mean, but it was one of those things where, I really wasn't prepared for that. And I didn't feel guilty because it is what it wasn't like I was ordering, room service, but it was an education, certainly.
A less trusting boss may have found it awkward that this was coming out of Vegas, but of course it was a legitimate business expense, as you said.
Possibly. But one thing I mentioned earlier, Sri, about going to Hawaii, one of the funny realities of journalism is that whenever I went to Hawaii, it was, of course, wonderful to see Hawaii, and it's an interesting part of the country. But I worked very, very hard because you're 6 hours behind New York. So if you were there on a breaking story, you had to get up very early indeed. And I would really spend a week there working quite diligently. And my old friend Lou Cannon of the Washington Post used to tell stories about, when he would cover the Reagan White House and be in Santa Barbara or whatever, people would be envious of him and think that he had a wonderful life. And he would point out how busy and how incredibly, intense the work could be. But then he was on assignment once in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and he got all sorts of sympathy notes. How can you be in this godforsaken place that must be miserable? And it turned out that there were some longtime FBI agents or someone like that who he was genuinely friends with. And whatever the story was on was a kind of desultory pace. So he actually had a lovely, wonderful time catching up with old friends in Rock Springs. And he was much happier to be there than in whatever this theoretically, cushy destination that friends envied.
But I understand what you mean about Hawaii. I got to spend about 10 days on work there a couple of years ago at the wonderful former Daisy Duke, Doris Duke estate.
Oh, yeah.
Doris Duke estate at the Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art and Culture, and no one believed it was work. So you, in fact, end up working harder because people back east are super jealous.
Exactly.
Okay, we should bring Neil back on so we can look at the rest of the paper. We have about 25 minutes with you. So Neil, if you want to come back on and take us through the sections, and then Todd can comment as you show us different stories.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. So let's take a look at the front page section inside the front section. I always appreciate looking at the inside the Times Insider column. This is a piece by Suhasini Raj, My Two Anguished Views of COVID. I'm curious, Todd, have you ever written a piece for the Insider column or been the subject of an Insider piece?
I think before it was designated as such, well, we didn't have that feature when I was at the paper, but I did write a piece that ran on Election Day in 2016 about what it was like to cover the election. And I think it was a comparable first person account of how, but sort of lifting the curtain behind the scenes. But these features tended to be more something that would run in our old house organ called Times Talk, which was an internal publication for colleagues. But we didn't have, there wasn't a public facing feature like this when I was at the paper.
Okay. And other features, again, on page 2 and 3, we like focusing on this because it's not as readily available in on the online edition. The On This Day in History, and sorry about the lighting here. See if I can get better light on that. Churchill, I guess we're dealing with shadows. There we go, a little bit better. Churchill dies at 90 at home in London. This was from January 24th, 1965. We have the of interest section, which is kind of a teasing various articles in the paper. This one from The Loneliness of the Black Senator in the magazine. Blanche Bruce of Mississippi, the son of an enslaved black woman and a white man who considered her his property, is the only American to have gone from slavery to the U.S. Senate, beginning his term in 1875. That's definitely an interesting story. In arts and leisure, in Australia, at least 434 Indigenous people have died in police custody since 1991. In the magazine also, What If You Never Get Better? We referenced this when we looked at the cover. A 32-year-old woman with long COVID in which patients still show symptoms like brain fog months after contracting the coronavirus said she had become so forgetful that she had to write notes to remind herself to eat. So there's that section, there's the conversation spotlight. But I also want to take a quick look up here. We don't usually spend a lot of time on the masthead. Again, it's a little bit hard with the shadows, my apologies. But I see Kathleen Kingsbury has been named the editorial page editor. If I'm not mistaken, Sheree, she was the acting editor until recently. I think the news just came out this week in terms of the announcement. So congratulations to Kathleen on taking that role. And let's see what else.
Can I just stop you 1 second, Neil? In addition to all the excellent editorial features you're pointing out there that are unique to just go back to page 3 if you don't mind. In the upper right-hand corner of A3, for as long as I can remember, the Tiffany ad has been an absolute staple of that space in the print paper, and it's just like an old friend. It's there virtually every day in the same spot, and it has been for at least 50 years, maybe much more.
In fact, it's 100 years. Stuart Elliott was our guest on the New York Times very long-time media and advertising columnist. I assume you may have overlapped with him.
Yes, very much.
In your tenure. He was our guest on the show, and he pointed that out to us, that Tiffany actually pays a premium to have that particular placement and has owned that spot on page 3. Much of the page 2 and 3 has changed over the years in terms of where the corrections go and how the layout is, but the Tiffany ad has been constant, as you said. Thank you for mentioning that. Absolutely. Here's a quote of the day at the bottom, going back to the discussion about Hank Aaron. And I'm fighting the sun, so I'll just read it. There was no book on Henry Aaron. He had the book on you. You pretty much went in there and said, I hope my stuff is good enough tonight because you're going to need it. That's a quote by Al Downing, the pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers, who gave up the record-breaking home run number 715 to Hank Aaron. And for those who aren't baseball fans, when he's talking about, I hope my stuff is good enough tonight, he's talking about hopefully his pitches are good enough to take on the great Henry Aaron. So the Times has started this section, obviously recently tracking an outbreak. This is looking at Arizona. Virus spreads like wildfire through America's salad bowl. Migration, the daily flow of people, and lax efforts to contain make a perfect storm in Yuma County. Several photographs here.
Can I just say one thing? I was surprised that America's Salad Bowl is in Arizona. I thought it was in Central California.
In terms of the Imperial Valley, I would think.
No, well, it's just that's where you think of all the lettuce and all the other parts that come. So when you hear, at least when I hear America's Salad Bowl, I think of that Central California Valley and not Arizona. That's what it surprised me.
Well, and the explanation, Yuma County, which produces the lettuce, broccoli, and other leafy greens that Americans consume during the cold months, is known as America's Salad Bowl. That's news to me as well, Sheree.
I mean, maybe because of the winter months, they said during the winter months, maybe they produced during the summer months in California. Who knows? That
might be it. One of the things we also take a look at is the advertisements in the paper, which again you only see on the print, or you see in this way in the print edition. A full page ad, eliminate the filibuster, end the gridlock, paid for by Fix Our Senate. Some of the groups supporting this: Fix Our Senate, Stand Up America, Public Citizen, CWA, Common Cause. Americans just voted to put Democrats in charge of the Senate. As Senator Schumer and Senate Democrats going to let Mitch McConnell keep running the show?
Let's ask Todd to explain filibuster to our non-Americans and even some Americans who will need that. And if you can frame what is happening right now.
Well, the filibuster is formally known as Rule 22 of the Senate, and it's basically a requirement that you need 60 votes to end debate and move to consideration of any normal measure. Some years ago, when Harry Reid was the majority leader, the Democratic leader of the Senate, when the Democrats were in control, he eliminated the filibuster for regular judicial nominations. And Mitch McConnell subsequently eliminated it, or he didn't by fiat eliminate it, but had the majority of the chamber vote to eliminate it for Supreme Court judicial nominations. But it remains for substantive legislation. And the challenge for the Democrats in a 50-50 Senate, where Vice President Harris is the tie-breaking 51st vote, is getting 60 votes to do something like pass President Biden's proposed pandemic relief plan or immigration overhaul or any other substantive bill he may want to do. And as long as that 60 vote requirement is there, it's a very big challenge to get enough Republicans to sign on to any substantive policy issue in order to pass it. President Biden has been on record as being pretty reluctant to eliminate the filibuster because I think traditional Democrats, himself included, worry about what would happen to them when they're in the minority, because the filibuster is the ultimate protection in the Senate of the rights of the minority. And of course, the Senate itself is structured, by having tiny states have the same two senators as California and New York to protect the rights of minorities in small states. And it was a threshold compromise with the Constitution between North and South to begin with. Historically, the filibuster in the 20th century was most often used to block civil rights legislation and to perpetuate segregation. And the challenge now is, if it's eliminated, it would make it easier for the party in power to work its will, but it would make it harder for the minority party to block things it wanted to block. So I think the immediate challenge is that Mitch McConnell has said, unless the Democrats agree to preserve the filibuster as an option, he is unwilling to work out the modus vivendi that would be required to operate a 50-50 Senate. And unless he does that, and unless he passes new organizing rules for the current Senate are passed, the existing structure, which has Republicans as chairs of the committees because they had the control in the last Congress, will persist. So there's a certain amount of hostage taking going on here, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the first instance. But I think that although progressives are very interested in eliminating the filibuster and think it's a vestigial appendix that only causes harm, sort of like the Electoral College, there's probably enough critical mass among Democrats in the Senate that it would be unlikely to be eliminated right away, partly because they want to save it as a so-called nuclear option to invoke later in the midst of some really important debate.
Two quick things. Laura says, I've been reading that people would like to label it the Jim Crow filibuster to put more energy behind eliminating it, pointing out that it was part of the compromise that you were describing. The other thing is, why did the Senate minority, when it was the Democrats, not use the filibuster for Amy Coney Barrett? It's because they had eliminated it for...
It's because they'd eliminated it for
there's nothing they could do. There was
nothing they could do. And that's an example of why the Democrats would say that the filibuster, has its uses, because if there still had been a filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, they might well have been able to have... I don't know if they still could have blocked it, because I don't know if they could get, the necessary votes, but they could have thrown a lot more sand in the gears and slowed it down. Maybe slowed it down beyond the election.
Sure. Thanks. Go ahead, Neil.
Absolutely. So,
More ads. Here's a long ad too on the other side.
Yeah, I know. There's a continuation of that piece on the student suicides in Las Vegas. But here's another full-page ad on addressing President Biden. You can be the climate president, signed by a number of climatepower2021.org is who paid for this ad. As we continue, this is about the virus, continuing with the coronavirus, the piece about the Los Angeles, the epidemic in Los Angeles. Could a smell test screen for COVID? And international, this is a really interesting story, Shri. So I actually lived in Cairo for 2 years back in 2003, 2005 under Mubarak. Declan Walsh wrote a long piece about the history of Tahrir Square, which, if you can see the picture at the bottom, you can just make out the square. It's full of people, hundreds of thousands protesting in February 2011. This is what the square looks like now under General Assisi. And one of the interesting things about it is that General Assisi is moving most of the government buildings to the desert, about 25 miles outside of Cairo, to take the power out of downtown Cairo, to remove it as a focal point for protests, etc. But this is a great, if anyone's interested in the history of Egypt and protests and the evolution of public space, this is a great piece by Declan Walsh. This is to your point, Todd. I saw this come across on social media and read the piece. I think it was yesterday, and then you catch up and you see what's in the Times and the actual hard copy the next day. This is a piece about the protests in Russia, the pro-Alexei Navalny protesters being arrested. And then we get into the national section. Liberal Christianity ascends with Biden's faith as the second Catholic president to take office in the U.S., the first, of course, being JFK. Interesting piece about Arizona, where they recently censured 3 influential figures. That's the article on the bottom. The governor, former Senator Jeff Flake, and Cindy McCain, the wife of John McCain, war hero. Here's a very long piece. I hadn't seen this online. Unmasking domestic abuse that begins long before assault. Coercive control in relationships isolates the victim. Congresswoman Cori Bush of Missouri has been sharing her story as a survivor of domestic abuse to help normalize the conversation. Before a former boyfriend escalated to violence, he began by monopolizing her time and curbing her independence. Aiming to define term, Biden targets racial inequity in early push. And certainly his cabinet is the most diverse in history. Certainly more diverse than what Trump put together, more diverse than what Obama did as well. Here's that piece that we referenced on the front page. I'm trying to move out of the lines of the shadow. This first piece is about assessing Trump as a president. Nixon, Harding, Buchanan, Trump may end up in the sub-basement is the headline on that. But the pictures here, and you saw this online as well, Todd, these were like 5-second video snippets, if I'm not mistaken, online, right? Showing Ashley Babbitt, among others, walking through. This is an interesting piece. If you can make this out, these are the protesters as they went into the rotunda, staying within the rope lines on the carpet in a seemingly orderly fashion. And they've highlighted Ashley Babbitt in that picture. Lawmakers being ushered out of the chamber. And this is the moment when Ashley Babbitt was being boosted through a window, and then when she was fatally shot by an officer, and she fell backwards just after this shot. And this is a Capitol Police officer. You can't make it out on screen, but that's an arm, and he's pointing a gun in her direction. What were you last week? Was it last week? 2 weeks ago now. Where were you January 6th? What were you doing?
I was here at home watching the news, obviously. Incredibly saddened by it. When I was a teenager in the summer of 1978, I was a page in the House of Representatives, and obviously I spent a lot of time in the Capitol as a reporter over the years. Just a year ago now, I was there for the Atlantic covering President Trump's first impeachment, and I've wandered those halls, for the better part of the past 40 years and more, and it was just stunning to me. It remains stunning to see that hundreds of people could have breached the security and gone inside and defiled the Senate chamber, and it's beyond comprehension how it happened, and frankly beyond comprehension how they thought it would be a good idea to do. I mean, it's just really sad.
Here's another headline: Capitol rioter threatened to assassinate Ocasio-Cortez, officials say. Here's the Larry King obit inside. You can see almost a full page. Several pictures of Larry, and I guess he also had a I hadn't known this, a let's play with Donald Trump's hair moment, as Jimmy Fallon did, somewhat infamously. And then we have the rest of the front page and the sports section as well. This is on the Green Bay Packers, and some of the history. The Packers band of brothers keeps dwindling. Famous sports franchise for those outside the U.S. are not as familiar with American football. This is the New York session. So since I'm here in outside Virginia, New York is relegated to just a page at the end of the front section, but a campus speech in the era of Zoom. And here's another piece about Henry Aaron. This is focusing, it's an interview with Al Downing, the pitcher who gave up his record-breaking home run. So that's a good look at the front page section. Again, we did a quick review of all of the sections earlier. The Sunday Review, Sunday Business, Book Review, Sunday Styles. When you read the paper, Todd, where do you go next? What is your preferred order? What sections do you focus on?
I guess I read the review first to look at the columnists and see what's going on. I certainly read the main section. I always love reading the book review. In these pandemic days, I think the at-home section I love looking at the recipes there. Arts and leisure. I read them all. And since I've left the paper, reading the Sunday paper is purely a pleasure. It was always a pleasure, but sometimes it felt like an obligation if you worked there. Now it just feels like a voluntary delight, really. And you don't, it's designed so that it can be read all during the day or even into Monday. It doesn't have to be read all at once. You can set it aside to read something you want to follow up later. As I said at the beginning, because of the digital world we live in, one has effectively or can effectively read a great deal of the Sunday paper before it appears in print, especially the Arts and Leisure, the magazine, the book review, those kinds of things. But there's still something about having it on your doorstep on Sunday mornings. Ours should be on our front lawn about now, I think, maybe half an hour ago.
I was going to ask you that. Do you finish reading the paper on Sunday, or do you let some of the sections stay on your bedside table or on your desk for a few days?
I try to finish it on Sundays. What's a challenge is if we go away on vacation, we usually don't stop the papers unless it's a long vacation. So then I plow through all the print papers when I get home, even though I've read it digitally when I'm away. There are things I find in the print paper that I simply haven't seen online. But no, I try to finish it by Sunday, just because the rest of the week will be on you before you know it, and you'll be behind.
Serendipity, as we were talking about earlier. I personally like to keep the book review and the Sunday review around. Those have staying power, if you will.
Absolutely, they're tended to, I think.
Certainly like to see that. If we didn't acknowledge, Mark Lee is joining us from Durham, North Carolina, a good friend of the show. Susan Soriano joining from my hometown of Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. Hi, Susan. My mom was joining as well earlier from Hastings. It's always good to have some Hastings representation. Apollo is joining us from Montclair, New Jersey. That's some of the other folks who are watching. Hello, Shri.
Great to hear this conversation. Todd, as we start to wrap up here, any thoughts for folks who are trying to understand the news and to see how things in Washington are going to unravel or how things are going to go in the next few weeks that we should look for? How would you know if Biden's having is having the impact and the change that he wants to bring?
Well, I mean, watch this space, I guess I would say. The first challenge for him is to get his cabinet appointees confirmed, and the odds look pretty good for some of those. If he gets anything like what he wants in terms of the COVID relief package done, that would be a very good sign. At the moment, there seems to be a lot of resistance, even from senators that he might expect to be sympathetic, like Susan Collins, I just saw this morning, is raising doubts about the size of the package. So he's got his work cut out for him, and the nature of the press and the media that we live in now will be that people are quickly looking to pronounce, roadblocks or failures, and there'll be a great deal of impatience to see what he can actually deliver on. So I guess in the coming, and then of course to see what happens in the second week of February when the impeachment trial begins, how Congress and how the Senate in particular can juggle those two competing priorities.
Yeah, one of the things, of course, is that people feel like Biden should get a pass on everything, considering how bad the last 4 years were in terms of press coverage and all of that. But the kind of attacking the press the way that Trump and his fellow cabinet members did on a regular basis. But did you see that story about the Rolex that Biden wears, and how there's a lot of criticism that this is like the tan suit scandal of the Obama years, meaning that the Times or other media folks are focusing on this, that he has a Peloton, he has a Rolex, like these are all scandals of some sort.
Yes, no, I think, and then there was a story the other day about whether his pledge to vaccinate 100 million people in 100 days, which had once seemed very ambitious, is now too low ball, and the time, Cheryl Gay Stolberg had a story in the Times about that, and you saw just axiomatically that the White House press corps quickly began asking Jen Psaki about it, which was really a testament to the Times's enduring power. But I mean, on the one hand, what kind of watch he wears is an interesting piece of intelligence. I mean, I guess Barack Obama favored Shinola. We know that President Bush #2 and Bill Clinton favored very plebeian style watches. But the story, I'll give the story this. It points out that LBJ and Dwight Eisenhower and were proud Rolex wearers. So there's a great presidential tradition. In fact, the Rolex president watch is named for the American president. So I mean, I guess a little bit of this is okay, but there's a risk of a certain breathlessness on the press always to pronounce, the sky is falling when it may just be trembling a little bit.
I hear you. I also wanted to just show you my newsletter, which comes out on Sunday mornings. We were talking about what's happening with social media, but this image that we used in the pieces about how I did not turn on my headlights because of all of these reasons, which are very similar to what we hear about the vaccine, and also strikes me, and you might remember this, when the Reagan era seatbelt laws were being enforced and people objected to it. And Elizabeth Dole was the person leading the charge, but some of the same arguments against masks and others and vaccines were being made for seatbelts. Here the joke is about headlights.
Good Lord. But don't most modern cars have the headlights come on automatically? I guess people then have to manually turn them off if they.
Yeah, I mean, this is a joke, right? But it's really that to think that when the seatbelts in 81, 82 were being forced onto people, they had the same kind of objections. And we'd love, if you haven't subscribed to my newsletter, you can find it at sreenet.substack.com, SREENET.substack.com. We'd love to, every Sunday we write about various aspects. And of course, this time we also have a promo for Todd's appearance here on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and on LinkedIn. Anything else, Neil, that you want to ask Todd before we let him go?
No, I think we're good.
Thank you very much, Todd. We will let you go. We have some housekeeping to do before we say goodbye, but you've been awesome. We've gotten great feedback here from various folks. Jonathan says, great show, interesting observations. Thank you. Roberta Oster is saying, thank you from and watching in Virginia. So thank you, Roberta, for being here. And lots of great links. Henley says, thanks for bringing that up. MSM never ceases to be ridiculous with false equivalence. So she's talking about the Rolodex. the Rolex, story. So thank you for your thoughts on that too, Todd.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure to be with you guys.
In particular, thanks for joining us so early on a Sunday morning, Todd. Go
No
back
worries.
to bed.
Thank you.
Doug says he learned a lot, so thank you for that too. All right.
Thank you.
And of course, as a reminder, Todd is joining us from Los Angeles, where it's just past 7 a.m. Pacific time.
Before we go, I don't know if we got to ask you, what are you working on now, and anything you'd like to tell us about that?
Well, I'm actually in the middle of preparing to teach a class at the University of Southern California starting this Wednesday, a 10-week class. I'm a visiting fellow there this semester, along with former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock of Virginia and Shaniqua McClendon of Crooked Media. And my class is on politics and the press. How do we get here? Where are we going? And it's an effort to introduce the undergraduates to a few of the topics about what's happened in the media over the past 50 years or so, and what its implications will be. And one of the things we want to try to delve into is what will happen with the media in the post-Trump era, and that seems like that's fertile ground. So I'm going to be relying on some of my former Times colleagues and friends for guest appearances to gnaw over these questions, and I look forward very much to trying to learn from my students as well.
And
before we let you go, Todd,
journalism school or the comms, the public policy part?
It's in the Dornsife School, which is the liberal arts college. There's my old friend Bob Shrum, the veteran Democratic consultant, and Mike Murphy, the Republican consultant who lives just up the street from us, run something called the Center for the Political Future, which is an effort to look about how we might find some partisan agreement in the face of these terrible divides. And the program is open to undergraduates and I guess graduate students too. But anyway, they have this visiting fellows program every semester, and now, of course, it will be all online. But looking very much forward to it.
They're terrific. They used to be on Meet the Press, I think, regularly, and I loved watching them. And
they
have a very good relationship, and they're very wise and funny.
Todd, before we let you go, I just want to ask you. We have a collection of letters that were written to you, trying to spell your name. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, when I was at the Times, I began noticing that a lot of people who presumably had seen my byline in print in the paper were sending me letters with gravely and widely and wildly misspelled or versions of my name. So you can see down at the bottom there's David Purdum, Todd Purdham, Purdini, Purdcorn, but my favorite, which you'll see right in the center, is Mr. Todd Turdum. And I kept wondering how people could possibly be making so many mistakes when they had seen my name in type. So I started collecting them, and ultimately I have a piece of paper that's about 2.5, 3 feet long. I think I was up to well over 50 when I left the paper 15 years ago, and now, of course, I don't really get much snail mail in that way, so maybe people are still misspelling my name, but I don't see it because they send me an email.
Sheree, so it's not just our names that sometimes get misspelled or mispronounced or mangled in various ways.
I had a collection like that as well, as you can imagine, with Sri Srinivas and what were some of the ways in which it was getting destroyed. So, but I love that you have that, and your books.
At least the people who did the artwork for your books got your name right, Todd.
There was
An Idea Whose Time Has Come, on Equal Rights, A Time of Our Choosing, on America's War in Iraq, and Something Wonderful. A little bit different, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution.
Yes, that was my kind of busman's holiday, but there was one occasion when I was covering the Clinton White House for the New York Times, and the president had issued the FDA was issuing some new regulations on tobacco. And for one edition, but the edition that came to Washington, the front page story in the New York Times misspelled my name, Purdom. And Britt Hume, who was then working at ABC News covering the White House, came and brandished the paper to me the next morning and said, "Boy, your bosses must think a lot of you if they can't get your name right on a page one story." And it only lasted one edition, but it was the one that came to Washington.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your stories, your anecdotes. Best to your wife as well, who we certainly have a lot of fans of. and I'm a West Wing fan myself, and appreciate everything you shared with us this morning.
Thank you guys again.
Great. So Shri, one of the things I wanted to do, we haven't done it in a while. I wanted to let people know that the New York Times, we usually show the cover of the New York Times Magazine, the video. They haven't done that the last 2 weeks, so we'll look into that, whether or not they're continuing or on a hiatus. But for our poetry fans out there, I would like to close with our New York Times Magazine poem, which we haven't done in a while. So I will pull that up. Again, before we close, and we'll use that as the closing, but I want to certainly thank again our team of Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranauckas. And speaking of Carla Baranauckas, want to highlight the Local Connection newsletter. The Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University brings you the Local Connection newsletter each week. It offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists. Best of all, it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips to learn more. So thank you again for our team, and check out this newsletter. Great tips every week to help local reporters. And Shri, you'll be leaving to cover She's on Call to help produce that show. Right, that's the generic card, and this week's card.
Yeah, very excited to have Apurva Mundavilli and Nina Shapiro join us at 11 a.m. Eastern. She's the science reporter at the New York Times who's been covering COVID, and she's awesome. And Nina Shapiro is a pediatric ENT surgeon, so please follow She's on Call to learn about that. And we've got to talk about next week's show. Absolutely, I'm thrilled.
Again, Carla Baranauckas hitting another home run with our guest, Charles Blode, New York Times op-ed columnist focusing on politics, public opinion, and social justice. He joined the New York Times in 1994 as a graphics editor and quickly became the paper's graphics director. So I'm definitely interested in hearing that story of how he went from graphics onto the op-ed page. So please join us next week, January 31st, for another edition of Shri's Sunday New York Times Read-Along.
We're very excited to have Charles with us. So you're ready to do some poetry, and thank you everybody for watching. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we'll bring that up right here. We'll see whether we can get that on the screen for you. So this week's poem, selected by Reginald Dwayne Betts, and so this is a change. Reginald Dwayne Betts. We haven't checked in a while. Reginald Dwayne Betts is a poet and lawyer. He created the Million Book Project, an initiative to curate microlibraries and install them in prisons across the country. His latest collection of poetry, Felon, explores the post-incarceration experience. In 2019, he won a National Magazine Award in Essays and Criticism for his article in the Times Magazine about his journey from teenage carjacker to aspiring lawyer. The description: the federal death penalty is returned. Once while I was in prison, I saw a man talk to a man on death row. The first man had no idea his friend would be executed. He asked, "When are you coming home?" The silence that followed has never left me. Martin Espada's poem says that Bartolomeo Vanzetti was more than whatever the state chose to execute him for. This is the poem that asks us if it's okay to name the date we'll murder and bury another. So we'll read the poem. On the night of his I now pronounce you dead. For Sacco and Vanzetti, executed August 23rd, 1927. On the night of his execution, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, immigrant from Italia, fishmonger, anarchist, shook the hand of Warden Hendry and thanked him for everything. I wish to forgive some people for what they are now doing to me, said Vanzetti, blindfolded, strapped down to the chair that would shoot 2,000 volts through his body. The warden's eyes were wet. The warden's mouth was dry. The warden heard his own voice croak. Under the law, I now pronounce you dead. No one could hear him. With the same hand that shook the hand of Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Warden Hendry of Charlestown Prison waved at the executioner, who gripped the switch to yank it down. The walls of Charlestown Prison are gone, to ruin, to dust, to mist. Where the prison stood, there is a school. In the hallways, tongues speak the Spanish of the Dominican, the Portuguese of Cabo Verde, the Creole of Haiti. No one can hear the last words of Vanzetti, or the howl of thousands on Boston Common whom they knew, when they knew. After midnight, at the hour of the execution, Warden Hendry sits in the cafeteria, his hand shaking as if shocked, rice flying off his fork so he cannot eat no matter how the hunger feeds on him, muttering the words that only he can hear. I now pronounce you dead. That poem was written by Martin Espada, and this is what the layout looks like in the magazine. That's something that we had historically. We've ended the New York Times read along with the poem. Shri has always said that the poem should be read by the author, understanding the cadence, where the emphasis should be. It should never be read cold, yet we do it anyway. I am personally glad that we had a chance to read this poem. Personally, very much against the death penalty, and on an editorial note, just aghast at what the Trump administration did in the last days before leaving, rushing to execute several people because they could. With that, that's another edition of Shri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Thank you for joining us. Always appreciate you contributing to the conversation, sharing this with friends, retweeting it. And Joanne's comment, powerful, is a great way to end not just the poem, but also the show itself. Until next week, we will see you again, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Take care.